Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation between Professor Kamala Ganesh and me on her journey in sociology and anthropology. This conversation is a part of a series of conversations being done by the Indian Sociological Society to help younger people actually understand uh, the making of sociology and the making of sociologists. And their idea is to get one sociologist to talk to another. It is my great privilege to be in conversation with Professor Ganesh. Kamala Ganesh and I go back a long time. I think I first met her in the classroom in St. Xavier's College in 1982, where I was a student of sociology. And subsequently in 1997, I enrolled for my PhD with Dr. Ganesh. And it's been a wonderful journey since then. She's been my mentor, my guide, and also a friend, I think. And feminist friendships have a certain quality of warmth, and we argue a lot, we discuss a lot, sometimes we even fight, but we know how to resolve it in a friendship which has continued for these many years. So I'm extremely happy to be doing this conversation with her. Let me now formally introduce Professor Ganesh to all of you. So, Professor Kamala Ganesh was formerly professor and head at the Department of Sociology at Mumbai University. She has also taught sociology at St. Xavier's College and SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. Her fields of research include gender, caste, and kinship, women's history and archiving for women, culture and identity, and the Indian diaspora. She has done ethnographic fieldwork in Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and also in Netherlands, Germany, and Canada. Lately, actually, she's been working with Muslim Nagaswaram musicians in Andhra and their syncretic connections with Carnatic music and with the canonical Hindu temples in the region.
Yeah.
In recent years, she has been Senior Research Fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, Scholar in Residence at Shiv Nadar University, and Professor M.N. Srinivas Chair Professor at the Institute of Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. Academic outreach is an important part of her work. She has held elected positions in the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, Indian Sociological Society, Indian Association of Women's Studies, and Commission on Women in the International Union for Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, right? Along with a team of Indian and Dutch anthropologists, she did ethnographic field work, which was a wonderful work, on elder care in Netherlands, leading to their joint publication called Care, Culture and Citizenship, Revisiting the Politics of the Dutch Welfare State. I hope she will speak about that a little today. Her book, Boundary Walls, Caste and Women in a Tamil Community, published in 1993, won the silver medal of the Asiatic Society of Bombay. The book Zero Point Bombay, In and Around Horniman Circle, co-edited by her, was listed by The Guardian London as among the 10 best books set in the city of Mumbai, which actually came out of a very wonderful project for which I was a part of on the Asiatic Society of Mumbai and to bring it, how to bring it alive for the city. Kamala Ganesh identifies herself as a feminist anthropologist. She has used the methodology of ethnography, combining it with historical and Indological sources where relevant. She has absorbed feminist approaches to reflexivity, social location, and intersectionality, which imbue her ethnography with a distinct character. She has used feminist principles and methodology to study subjects and institutions that are not focused on women also. Welcome, Kamla.
Thanks.
So let us start, Kamla, by uh, let me ask you about what you think is the role of professional bodies like the Indian Sociological Society. You've been an integral part at some point of the Indian Sociological Society. Would you like to share a few of your thoughts on the role of these bodies?
of the Indian Sociological
Indian
Society,
Sociological
certainly.
Society.
Let me begin by thanking you, Geeta, for agreeing to listening to a long lecture from me once again. Though I hope it will be a conversation.
Sure, it'll be enjoyable.
Okay. And thanks to the ISS, Indian Sociological Society, and Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary
Yeah.
for initiating this series, which I think cumulatively will have a tremendous value for the scholars to come, because it will be in the nature of recording and documenting a certain period in the growth of sociology. I have been a member of Indian Sociological Society, IS, for many years now, and also had long stints there as member of managing committee and on the sociological bulletin, the journal's editorial board, and so on. I think I've attended many of the annual conferences, and the first thing that struck me was that here was the only place in my sociological career of 50 years now,
50 years.
50 years, where I could see and meet and talk to sociologists and people connected to sociology as well from all parts of India, from rural, from big urban centers, the huge universities, small colleges, and from all different areas, from the northeast to Kashmir to all over India. And so this is what I realized is the nuts and bolts of sociology in India. And this is the only society of sociology that really manages that kind of an outreach and gives people from all these different places to be able to see and meet other sociologists whom they have read about or whom they have read. So it makes for great interaction. It was set up in 1951 by Professor Ghurye, and as you know, since both of us are alumni from University of Mumbai, that he set it up in 1951, and for the first few years he was helming it, and based in Bombay University then. And at that time, there was this great debate on whether Indian sociology in India should include social anthropology and cultural anthropology.
Yeah.
A sociological bulletin, which was the flagship journal, it took the stand that we would include both sociology and social anthropology and cultural anthropology. And that has been the pattern now among many different centers for sociology. So that set the pattern to have a very broad focus. So these are the things that I think still continue its all India character. Its ability to reach out to small college students, to research students, young teachers, and also attract senior professors who come and speak there. And so that character still remains as also its broad focus. So I think it's a wonderful. There are other associations there, but I think this is very special.
Yes. And it's quite a humbling experience to go for these conferences of the ISS and find how the discipline is thriving across, as you said, regions and, small cities and towns. And it's quite wonderful.
Yes,
Actually.
yes.
Yeah. So, Kamla, we are feminists, and for us, personal biographies and our own autobiographies are significant because they are so deeply related to the work that we do. If you don't mind, we'll start with talking about a few details or biographical information about your family, where you grew up, where you did your early education, and so on and so forth.
Yes, briefly, I am from a upper middle class, upper caste social background. My father was a high official in the Indian Railways, government job, and so we would move around all over India. So though I'm a Tamilian, my mother tongue is Tamil, but I've spent a lot of time in different parts of India. And it was a family, as many such families, who laid great stress on education, which included education for girls as well. At that time, when I was young, already education for girls was accepted. Though what kind of education, what kind of career, there are different other matters.
Yeah.
But basically, a family in which learning also was emphasized, as also some of course, we were all, we spoke Hindi, we spoke English, but there was also an emphasis in my family on cultural roots and therefore learning mother tongue, speaking mother tongue at home, because the arts and crafts of the region. So this was all part of festivals and so on, and a sort of a moderately religious family. So this is the kind of background
This interestingly reflects a lot in your research interests. You go along. We'll talk about that as we go along.
Yes.
If you're rooted in a regional identity and yet being the inside
Not
out.
so much identity as familiarity with those arts and crafts, certain skills acquired.
True
I
that.
didn't think of it consciously as an identity,
Yes.
but that's what I knew. That's what I learned, So, and also there was a focus on science, science education. So, cultural roots, music, but also science education. This was the
You
background.
studied science. You were saying about doing an undergraduate in science because there's a lot of focus.
Yeah, it was almost
If you're a
natural.
good student, you did science.
Precisely. If you did well, then you would take science. And at 9th standard, at that time, in the higher secondary system,
Yeah.
and once you had taken science, then you continued with science. It was not easy to come back to some other stream.
Yes.
And so it went on like that.
Yeah. So you've told me some very interesting stories about how sociology came into your consciousness.
Yeah.
Beginning with your story about how Radhika Ramasubban, who was also part of her department,
Yes.
happened to be a friend
yes.
of the family.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, no, but before that, already,
Oh, yes. Yes.
I did well in science in a mechanical kind of way, I think. I used to write well. I used to take part in debates, go to IIT and Presidency College. So a little bit different from a very typical science student's career trajectory. And I also started reading in the early 70s from Time magazine and some literature which would come home on the women's liberation movement. And that is the first time, I must have been about 17 or 18, that something like that, hit me. It hit me. I was not familiar with, I had not thought of women's role in our families, in the country, women's rights. I had not really thought about all that. Though at home, my father's sister, who was widowed very young, she used to stay with us because she didn't have any sons. And she would wear the typical attire of an old Brahmin widow. Old, what I mean is of an older time. That is, she would wear white, no blouse, and she would not. She would have shaved her hair.
How old was she when she was widowed?
I believe she was very young. She was married and she had a child.
Okay.
But the child died. So I think she came back to her brother's house after her husband passed away. She must have been 20, 22, something like that. Something like that.
That young, huh?
I think so. So this, visually, it would make some impact on me. But I didn't link it with anything at that time. She has parties there, the party is there, and we have to look after her. She has come to her brother's house, and then in turn, her brother passed away. Her brother's children, sons, including my father,
That's your father.
inherited the caretaking of her. So this was there in my mind. But when I started reading women's literature, suddenly something happened. And I started going back to all these little memories of, and so I started getting interested in this. I also was reading some reportage, and I felt that there was a lot of talk of women's subordination, women's oppression. But I didn't seem to get any lead to understand why and how it has happened.
Exactly.
At that time, it was not like that. So I said, I must study something. I must learn to look at it in a more analytical way. Science, the science in the scientist. But I was not interested in further doing science.
But you also did journalism in between.
Yes, so as an interim, I did journalism because I used to write all right. And when doing journalism also, you get exposed to some of the, which in a science education, chemistry, botany, physics, and not that way. So and I started thinking, which is the subject that would give me some tools to understand this, say, what seemed to be something quite large, not as simple as what I thought it was. And at that moment, I mean, sometimes some things are happening inside you, but it needs a trigger to bring it out. And Radhika Ramasubban, who was from our department, she's a sociologist, very renowned sociologist.
Sociology of science.
That's right. But at that time, she was looking at. She came home because her father and my father were colleagues in the Indian Railways.
Okay.
She came to visit us, and when I asked her what she was doing, she said that she was doing a PhD in sociology. The first time I heard the word sociology, I had not heard. It wasn't there in Chennai at that time. It was in Chennai. So she told me what she was doing, and so I said, maybe sociology is where I should.
Got your imagination.
That way. And then it happened around when I was about 20. After getting married, I moved to Bombay. And one of my earlier classmates in the journalism course, Suresh Sundareshan, he had also moved to Bombay.
Okay.
And he had registered for an MA in political science. So when we met in Bombay after I had moved, he said, why don't you come to the university? I'll take you to the when I had talked to him about sociology,
Right.
I'll introduce you.
Okay.
So one day I went, I think it was 1973.
Okay.
I went to the Kalina campus.
I was 10 years old, Kamala, at that time.
Yes. Yes. So, and I was 21.
You were already married then, right?
I got married. I was married. Just married.
Sorry to interrupt.
And we went to, the Kalina campus was just coming up at that time. It was a wilderness, but some buildings had come.
What a joyful campus.
It was beautiful. And the first person we saw was Manorama Savoor, professor of sociology. She was professor or reader at that time.
She was professor when she taught me, which was much later.
She was walking from the lecture complex back to the department through that corridor, open air corridor.
Yeah.
And Suresh stopped her and said, this is my friend from Chennai. She wants to do sociology, just like that. She was most charming, welcoming. She said, oh, really? Even I was in the old Madras presidency time. I was also in Madras. Come, I'll take you to meet Professor A.R. Desai.
Achha.
So welcoming, so warm.
Yeah.
Now, in my mind, Bombay University at that time had a huge image because it, along with Madras and Calcutta, it was set up in 1857 or so.
Yes.
So oldest and big names, Ambedkar and Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Ranade, all of them were Bombay University products, right? And I had also heard of Guri at that time. I just heard of Guri. So it had an image in my mind of something very large and imposing. But here was this lady who was so kind and warm. And one thing led to another. I met Dr. Desai, also very welcoming.
Yeah.
And they said that, listen, we can't take you for an MA straight because you have a science degree. You don't have an arts degree. And at that time, it was not possible. In Bombay University. Now it's easier.
After an aptitude test.
That's right. And then they said, why don't you attend classes for some time? Just sit in on our classes and you get an idea of what is sociology. Because for me, it was only women and women's position and how sociology is going to help me to understand that. I thought it was all, there will be some kind of a written something from where I could get all my, anyway. So I did sit in on all the classes, Ferreira's. They were all very nice about it. Even though they knew I could not do an MA there. So you
did an MA in SNDT University?
Yes, because that was also suggested by Desai.
Professor Desai.
After I had attended some of the classes, which were highly inspiring, but also highly confusing because I had no social science training of any kind. I didn't come with a BA in sociology. So I had not read all the masters. I didn't even know that they were the masters. So absolute zero. Except some debates and women's lib and all. Otherwise, I did notes. So I did attend these classes. And then I got into some projects with Dr. Desai and Mrs. Savur. They say, there are some research assistants positions. Why don't you do that for a while and work with us? So I did that.
Nice. It's a
And
good way to enter the
good way to enter. And in fact, Professor Desai put me on to Neera Desai, his wife, Professor Neera Desai, who was at that time writing stuff for the Towards Equality report, what eventually turned out to be the Committee on the Status of Women of India.
Yes, yes. And a classic text for us.
A classic text.
Change the
She was doing some preparatory work for that, in which she wrote me in to prepare a bibliography of what were the readings on women at that time.
which is exactly what you did with me when I came to you for a UNESCO project.
Well, we all start like that. We all start like
Such a
that.
nice way to actually enter a field,
Yes,
to do the bibliography.
bibliography.
Yeah.
No, Xerox machines had just, photocopying had just arrived on the scene, just
Okay.
arrived.
Okay.
So it was a miracle to
Hmm.
get texts and photocopy them from the library and then give it to Niraben for her compilation.
Asha.
Quite amazing kind of thing. And also with Dr. Desai and Mrs. Savur, they were doing a documented history of trade union movement in India.
India or Maharashtra?
India. I went to Lucknow, Kanpur. I was attached to Professor Savur,
Probably very much a part of their Marxist sociology and
which I did
engagement
not
with
know
it.
at that
You
time.
didn't know.
I didn't know at that time. I didn't know that sociologists could be Marxists. I didn't know that. Anyway, but it was learning on the, and both of them were, I mean, I must say this, extremely broad-minded and not at all preachy, so to say.
Yeah.
And they said, you do your research. You know, I traveled for that. So going to trade union offices, mill owners association, photocopying documents, that kind of thing for a little while. And then Dr. Desai said, listen, if you're really serious, do your MA in SNDT by correspondence, because they will take you. So that's how I got my MA in sociology.
So I can see that your early feel for the field, so to speak, must have started around this time also, no?
Yes.
When you went to all these trade union.
Yes, yes.
है ना?
So the theoretical part of sociology did not at that time appeal it. I was not that familiar with it.
Correct.
But going through it, and this way,
Yeah.
it did attract me.
Then you joined for your PhD with Professor Ferreira, right?
Mm.
And your PhD was actually one of the very interesting PhD on the Kottapallemar community
That's right.
in the South India.
In deep South India.
Yeah, deep South India.
Yes.
And how was that actually? How did you
Yeah,
some arrive at the thought?
after doing my MA, my mind was on what next.
Okay.
What next? I'd always been very keen on studies, as we call it. No? You must do your studies.
But by this time, I think you were already expecting your first baby.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
During your field work, I think it's something.
No, before I began my field work.
Before you began.
So this is, curiosity. Reading some random newspaper reports
On
about the
Kottapallemar.
community in Tamil Nadu. I was in Bombay, mind you.
Yeah.
Here and there I found a report on a small community called Kottai Pillaimar or Kottai Vellala, where the whole community ran to few hundred people at that time, was living in a fortress in Tirunelveli district in Tamil Nadu, South Tamil Nadu. And the women of that community, said the report, had always lived inside the fort. The fort was a mud-walled fort, not a Rajput fort as we would imagine. A mud-walled fort, small affair, like an enclosure. And the women were born in that and they stayed and they did not come out until they died. And the report said, outside males, including government officials, collectors, British collectors, nobody was allowed inside because they had the sanction of the Pandya kings. They had they were allowed to have this kind of sealed setup. The men would come out. The men had business outside. They were big landholders, high upper caste, highly high up in the hierarchy, Saiva Pillais. And they owned a lot of land. They had given big donations both to temples, schools, panchayat board. They were big shots in that area. And the women were like this. That is what whetted my curiosity. I think essentially in many of my projects, I don't begin with a macro idea. I begin with some incident or event that sparkles curiosity, and I then follow it. Sometimes it does begin when it is. I find when I look at my work, when I sometimes either an organization or an institution or a professor says, this is the area, why don't we do like the trade union movement. So I went into it because that project was there, and I had said, let me get a little experience.
Yeah.
But when I did things for myself, it would be some random.
Like even now, this Nagaswaram project you're
That's
doing,
right.
we'll talk about
We'll
that.
talk about it later. It started with one event, and from that, following the lead, I then landed up doing something more.
And for people, like I saying, who've been sort of trained in the discipline, it might begin as a macro theoretical question and then go narrow down into the
Trained in the discipline is not enough.
Mm.
To start with a macro perspective, just the training in the discipline is one part of it. But you must have some experience and ability to see the larger picture. Your training only gives you already developed frameworks. But to be able to see a larger picture and see that this framework can be useful here,
Sure.
you have to be a little further into it.
Young researchers often come to us by saying, oh, I've done this now, fieldwork. What theory should I apply to it?
Precisely.
And
Precisely. Theory and field are like separate.
Yeah.
For me, it has always been going into the field, and then meanwhile simultaneously various perspectives are happening around you, and then for me everything then came into feminism.
Yeah.
In some ways, though I resisted it, I must say, I resisted it. So this is the research for me was at that time, because of all the shrill reportage, that is it something exotic, or I didn't like the tone. There were lots of reports, including one in the New York Times and so on. This community had been written about. In the reportage was all in the tone of
Orientalist exotica. Something
the tone of making it something very unusual and exotic, I would say. But what lay at the basis of it, that was my and with my training in sociology, such as it was, I could see that the caste position of the Kotte Pillemar had something to do with the women's seclusion.
In fact, I'd say, would you agree if I said that this is one of probably the earliest work which linked caste purity with the control of women and sexuality?
I think so.
Ethnographically, at least established.
Yeah. Earlier in 1963, Noor Yalman, who is a Turkish anthropologist, he had worked on some of the castes in Malabar, as he called it, and Ceylon. Tamil caste and Kerala caste, looking at matrilineal and women's sexuality. And he made this, but it was based on already published sources. And he made a link between the purity of the caste and the ritualization of women's sexuality. That's how he puts it. In contrast to men's sexuality, which is not ritualized. So he was somewhere there.
Okay.
But in my case, I had a whole community before me, living and functioning, whose essence I saw, the essence of the seclusion in the fort. Why? Because questions were asked at that time. We have parda in North India, we don't have parda in South India. Even Muslim communities in Tamil Nadu at that time were not very covering their, it was not very common. So where,
The social parda is there through these practices.
no, so parda is
seclusion.
not a term from in that milieu. So it is about purity and honor and Kannagi and all the heroines of the past, chastity. Those are the tropes there. Anyway, so yes, after I did my work was essentially to put it very simply, the Kotte Pillemar's caste position in that South Indian, Southern India, Southern Tamil Nadu scenario, it was based on ritual purity and honor, both. Because purity to a large extent, but also honor. And that honor of that caste depended on the purity of the women, purity of the women. And purity of the women depended on their sexuality being under some kind of restraint, surveillance, restraint, control.
Yeah.
And so this seclusion, which is a kind of a dramatic expression, but of that same principle, that the upper castes, the women's purity is a crucial factor in the caste's position in the hierarchy.
Correct.
This was the kind of argument that
I mean, we know that much earlier, both Phule Ambedkar had indicated this, and Uma Chakravarti built on it in the 90s through her.
Yes, Uma Chakravarti's work on Brahminical patriarchy was the first article in EPW in the early 1993 or something like that. Yeah, but mine was a demonstration in great detail, micro detail of a single community, and to what extent and what kind of manifestations that the purity of the women is the purity of the caste. That equation, in what ways it was being.
It was quite, in that sense, anthropological, because it was based on tools like participant observation.
Yes, ethnography.
Right?
It was very much based on ethnography.
Yes.
Yes.
This whole content about caste and gender made it as one chapter in your thesis and your.
Yeah, there were two parts, so to say, two phases of my thesis. And also my relationships there. One is me and myself. What do I feel? But me and my field. The women, the men, their whole setup, and those were very. They had very powerful impact on me.
But you said that you had to sort of keep it a little bit at
bay. Yes, indeed. Because at that time, 75, 76 and all that, research on women in our sociology department was looked at with kind of benevolent indulgence, little disdain on. It's this is the women's bandwagon kind. So I was very much under pressure to prove to my guide that I'm not just talking about the women, which was my source of interest, but how could such a community exist? What were the sort of what shall we say, the connections, the networks, the local, which made it possible. So one had to go into a little bit of history, and I did manage to unearth good historical material from the archives for the British period and from the temple inscriptions for the medieval period from 14th, 15th. And I was able to establish that this group, and the names of that group, Kottail, Varum, so and so, who lives in the Kottai in Sri Vaikuntham. This is the donation he made to such and such temple, etc. So I did good history. It was good.
Anthropology.
Good. But for me, it was also to convince my PhD, the whole academy, that this had some basis in facts. And that history. And so this was a dual thing. And I wanted my thesis also to sound very scientific. Because at that time, ethnography and ethnographic writing were well established. But they had to measure to the canons of science as had been interpreted by anthropologists. Anthropology as a science. Anthropology was initially put in the category of a science, and still, as you know, the AAA calls anthropology as a science, which includes many things and so on. So this was my dual. On the one hand, very fundamental notions that I had were being put to the test in the field. And the field has that impact on many people.
Absolutely. No, and this tension seems something that is very felt by many young scholars also who want to study gender or you want to study caste. What do we do with the scientificity of the discipline, and how do we take positions and standpoints? So let me take you now to then you've you've spoken a lot to me about how you revisited this work.
Yes.
While you wrote it up, you had a chapter on gender and you were trying to manage this balance between doing gender but, doing anthropology as if they were distant.
As though they were distant.
And then you revisited this later. And that revisitation actually features in the article that you wrote for Leela Dubey, another volume on gendered fields.
Yes,
no?
yes.
So it would be lovely for younger scholars to understand what that revisitation meant to you and what was the outcome of that revisitation.
As I was doing in the 80s, my PhD and going to the field and coming back and all that, because I needed academic validation, a deep-seated need in me, given my kind of family background, learning and academics and all that. But simultaneously, Bombay at that time was in the throes of the what is now called as the second wave or the autonomous women's movement, and I got involved in some of the organizations there.
Like FAO.
First it was Forum Against Rape, FAR. And FAO. And then in the meanwhile, IAWS was formed, Indian Association of Women's Studies.
Right.
The first National Conference on Women's Studies was held in SNDT in the early 1980s. I met a lot of feminists. And so that part of me, till I did the Kotepal MR work, I was more academic. But with my engagement in these organizations and in the issues and so on, I became more and more feminist in a limited way, I would say, because my foot was still in the academy.
Yeah, and there are complex ways of being feminist and academic.
All that came up later. And so I was involved in some of these activities. And I also came, also in that time, academic feminism was also developing in India.
Slow. And we didn't have these words also.
We didn't have these words. So in the 80s, Indian Association of Women's Studies actually at that time sort of brought together the activists, the movement, and the more academic people and so on. So I also came in touch with Professor Leela Dubey. Professor Leela Dubey and Neera Desai were both members of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, CSWI. So they had academic roots as well as very clear engagement with activism. And so I interacted with them quite a lot. And with Leela Dubey, I also explored, and I was a member of this International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences and the secretary of their Commission on Women, which gave me an opportunity to interact with European and American and also from the global south feminist anthropologists. They were not just feminists, they had specific connections with anthropology. And that time was the time when feminist anthropology was developing, blooming, blossoming, I would say. And so concepts like reflexivity, intersectionality, location, these were very much part of our discussion, and the need to look at ethnographic fieldwork through gendered lens. And in fact, out of that interaction, a volume came out edited by Diane Bell, Pat Kaplan, and Wazir Jahan Karim, called Gendered Fields, Men, Women and Ethnography.
Not Leela Dubey? She was not part of it?
No, Leela Dubey was the person who blessed the project.
Okay.
That way. But under her general umbrella, you could say. And so that, I think, was one of the first, or the first, book to look at field work and ethnography through a gendered lens. That work was done in the late 80s. And there I took this chance to look at my Kotai Pulaimar work.
And go back.
And I understood what reflexivity meant.
And your own role as it.
My role and in my location in life and in the field. Because these words for the last 3-4 years, we had all been discussing it in conferences and so on. So I would say my introduction to the idea of reflexivity and intersectionality and location came not from my anthropological training, but from the feminist anthropologists who were talking about it in vis-a-vis their own field experiences.
And in turn with the activism or movement connection.
And so on.
That's interesting, no?
That was the
feminist.
So this helped me to look back at my Kote Pulaimar work of 4 or 5 years ago. And I saw that what was the impact that my being there in the field was having on that field. Think about it, not that we had answers.
Yeah.
And my own personal relationship with the Kote Pulaimar women, which was a very, what I would say, emotional and volatile one in my mind. Because while I saw them during field work as completely different from me, living in this fort and... but I also started seeing similarities.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, I have been to school, I've been to college, and they have had homeschooling, as we would call it now. But is there so much difference? At least my grandaunt, that picture of my grandaunt, they are now so little bit like what my grandaunt was 40, 50 years ago. So that kind of my relationship with the Kote Pulaimar, I could give words to it.
I think there's a very important lesson here for younger scholars to know that, your PhD work can be revisited, rethought as you grow as a scholar. We often...
Yeah, because it is in the meanwhile that all these concepts were coming out of feminism. But for me, it was feminist anthropology that led the way for me. And so my relationship with the women and my relationship with the academy. So all these locations, the multiple locations that I was holding, also to explain to my family what I was doing. Sitting in a fort and doing what research kind of thing. So I would say those ideas came to me and I worked it out and I wrote a piece. On
so also it maps the shifts of anthropology also. Anthropology as a study of other and the primitive versus anthropology as a study of the self.
Yes.
But then you went, talking about this anthropology of the other and the self and the complexity there, you did that entire what we call the reverse ethnography.
Yes.
In Netherlands.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about
yes,
that?
That came maybe a decade later. Later, but that was at that time it was a little...
By this time you had joined the Bombay University as
Yes, I took leave and went to the Netherlands.
And you went to,
yeah. So this was a project conceived of by a Dutch anthropologist, Carla Rissu, and in collaboration with Maitreyi Krishnaraj, and two of us were anthropologists, Rajni Palriwala
from
Delhi University, and myself. And the idea then was, I think IDPAD was our funding organization, Indo-Dutch Programs for Alternatives in Development. And the mandate was to look at the changing Dutch welfare state, which was retracting from the Netherlands was known for its very generous welfare system. At that time, it was shifting around. That shift has been continuing towards private care, towards home, towards staying in the home rather than going to getting automatic admission into old age homes and nursing homes. I mean, when I first went to some of those old age homes, I thought they were palatial, like 5-star hotels. That was my reaction. But they were cutting down and they were encouraging. I did the work on the elderly. The others, we parceled out different aspects of the Dutch welfare state. And so I did ethnographic research with more than 100 people.
And this was not on elderly women. It was on elderly.
It was on elder care, social support networks of the elderly. That was it. But it had a gendered aspect to it. It had a very much a gendered aspect to it because among the single or extremely old, there was a predominance of women. And among the poorer old elderly, there was a predominance of women. The elderly women were more likely to be poor, in need of care than men. And the care that was given to them either by institutions or by family was by women. So this was a gendered care. The care was gender.
But what I'm saying is, feminist anthropology need not be, like you also say, need not be only about women. It can be about, say, for example, elderly care. It can be about state policy.
Yes.
And then you will find something to do with gender.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So,
Kamala, sorry.
without going into the details of what we found, etc., we were able to collectively make some interventions both in Dutch policy. Here, again, the reverse research, our informants thought that we were doing this research to take it back to poor Indian older people and apply it for them.
Yeah.
But we said, no, this is for Dutch policy, showing Dutch policy where it can improve itself.
Very interesting.
Then immediately it brings into focus the relationships in the ethnographic research, whether you are researching up or researching down.
Exactly.
We think we are researching down in the traditional anthropological equation, but here we were researching up.
Yes.
Because many of the people we talked to were well off,
And you do researching the, uh, Western society.
Western society, Indians coming in.
We don't get to,
Well, it's happening now. It's happening now.
much.
And more in the diaspora context. But it is happening now. But at that time, it was somewhat
You
special.
did that with your Tamil diaspora work also.
Yes,
We
but
talk-
here, one of the other things that Carla and all of us had decided was the results of this work, we will present it back to our informants before we present it to Dutch policy.
That's again something that feminist research.
That's all. That's all. For me, it has come through my interactions with feminist anthropologists. So we had a meeting with many of those whom we had talked to.
Yeah.
We presented it to them, and then sent it to the concerned departments and so on.
We will link Kamala's website where more can be found on this work also. So, Kamala, let me take you now briefly to the question of, see, you came into the department probably I was a 10th when I joined. Woman in such an old.
Before we go to that, sorry for the thing, there's that one of the, reflexivity, intersectionality, location, but also something that I absorbed was that feminist methodology and feminist ideas that don't have to be applied only to women.
That's
what you were saying.
Yeah.
So that is how I got into doing that a project. Archiving the Cancer Institute of Adyar.
Yes.
If you remember that because you were also,
volume.
yeah, that came for your, and I did a study on the Dr. Shanta and Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy and so on.
Yes.
So cutting a story short, it was not an obviously feminist project because the Cancer Institute, the patients are both men and women, doctors are both men and women. So what is the angle there? But here it turned out it is one of those exceptional institutions set up in the early Nehruvian era based on ideals of reaching out and technological excellence. Two things together is very difficult to achieve.
Yes.
So they were in the forefront of radiation technology at that time in the 50s and 60s. And very much part of Nehruvian scientific temper and that approach.
Yes.
At the same time, Muthulakshmi Reddy, who was the founder, was also deeply involved in social reform and in the freedom movement. So she had notions of what this care is meant for whom is this meant.
Yeah.
And so the kind of combination of reaching out to poorer patients and making it affordable for them, and also importing, at that time there was a lot of importing of radiation and other technology, and making this mix was a unique model. That model doesn't exist now.
Yeah.
The Cancer Institute is there and it has that model, but lots of compromises have been made.
You've told me how you've written about this in the one is about how for the impulse for Muthulakshmi Reddy was the fact that her sister had rectal cancer.
Yes.
And she'd seen her suffering. So it's very interesting how
the impulse for her son joining it, Dr. Krishnamurthy, who was also at the helm. Dr. Krishnamurthy was a doctor and in UK or US, and he didn't want to come back to India. But Muthulakshmi had started this institute and she needed help. Son was not willing. So she sent a telegram to him. Dr. Krishnamurthy told me. She sent a telegram to him. Mother serious, start immediately. So he left it and came, and he found that his mother was hale and hearty. But he had made the he made the transition.
Come up with.
Yeah. So all this went into, and then Dr. Shanta joined. Shanta has her own history. I've written about it. But the thing is that all the three of them were united in this model of technological and scientific excellence
Plus,
and reaching out to the poor, plus a care ethic, not just treatment.
Yeah.
So this combination happened. It fructified. There were other doctors. So many people came in, but they were able to keep it like that for several decades because of the what I would call the intimate personal relationships between the three protagonists, which helped to fuel a macro institution which was which had a very good name and a very good history.
Yeah.
So
No,
here I was seeing the feminist perspective on looking at the small, the intimate, and not seeing it just as an extension of the macro, but in fact it can also fuel the macro. This is what this research.
That wonderful work, actually. I could go on speaking about how we need to bring in this relationality and Poirer's principles in the medical discipline. Now, Kamala, briefly, I wanted to take you to the question of the early women. You know, as I was saying, and we probably, there were only about 10, 11 women in a department which is 100-year-old.
Yes.
You know, in Bombay University department. And I was probably the 10th, you must have been probably the 6th or 5th, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the point is that in our joint interest in looking at retrieving early women
Yes.
in sociology, you did a lot of work on Iravati Karve and Meera Desai,
Yes.
Liza Dubey. You know. Would you like to speak a little bit about how, as feminists today, we want to look at early women in,
Yeah.
because my understanding is a lot of work that early women in sociology and anthropology did was also what we can call outside of sociology, which was
Volunteerism.
volunteerism and
Running some kitchen for making like this Chandrakala Hate who made trained women to make snacks and sell.
And it's still running.
It's still
Sakhi.
Kudumba Sakhi.
So we did a lot of work which now gets called social work rather than sociology.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's important to bridge the gap between. That's how women actually did a lot of social.
Yeah.
And also because they didn't find a place. Iravati Karve, for example, didn't find a place in Bombay University.
That was other reasons, their personal relations with Professor Gurye, for example.
Yes,
Yeah.
So, what do you think are the challenges for us to read?
Well, I did I did
briefly.
I did not look at all aspects. I looked at, I chose women who were born in the 1920s. That was the first generation, barring two exceptions. They were Iravati Karve and Chandrakala Hate. They were born in, I think, 1903 and 1905 or something, respectively. Otherwise, the earliest women in sociology were those who were born in the 1920s. So I think I focused on Leela Dubey, Meera Desai, Bela Datta Gupta,
Chandrakala Hate also.
Chandrakala Hate, Iravati Karve, and Parvatamma, and Manorama Savur, Hemalata Acharya. These were the women born in the 1920s. I arbitrarily decided that I will take that. Because
wasn't all that arbitrary, because it's, women came in after the generation.
Yeah, they were the 30s also, the one in the 30s. These were women. And my question to them was not whether they are feminists or not. That was not my question. As women in that time, in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, they could not have been untouched by the happenings, of course, freedom movement, but also later the women's movement. The Committee on the Status of Women in India had come. We were all talking. So some of these women were part of, they identified themselves as feminists. and they did work as feminists, both Leela Dubey and Neera Desai. Now, Iravati Karve and Chandrakala Hate were prior to the second wave of women's movement and all that. So they didn't have the feminist tools and concepts available to them. But they did tremendous work.
You say that there was always that atmosphere also saying feminism is not indigenous, it is Western.
That a little later. That would be, we can talk about it a little later. But here, some women said, well, did not actually do work on women, but they showed it in their other activities. For example, Hemalata Acharya or Parvatamma, they did a lot of welfare activities and Chandrakala Hate for women, meaning they had a empathy for
Of
that.
course.
And yet other women refused to accept that they were feminists. So there was a range of reactions.
Responses. Even today we see that, no? Women in sociology or anthropology will actually resist sometimes of being called feminist.
But all of them did have an empathetic. Bela Datta Gupta never spoke a word about women in all her sociology career. But after retiring, she became chairperson of the West Bengal State Women's Commission, did tremendous work. Manorama Savur, I think partly because saying that you were a sociologist working on women would not always be received very seriously. So they hesitated, especially in Bombay University, as you know. In that time when Marxist sociology was at an ascendant with Professor Desai's influence, they were not against women, but they were subsumed. So some of them, Savur later on, she joined a voluntary organization, women's, and did a lot of work. But she never wrote about it. So this was my question. How did those women, those 7 or 8 women in that time, how did they react to the idea?
A very wonderful piece. I hope people will read that, younger scholars particularly. So, Kamala, you know, kinship as a field of study is actually probably not as popular today as it should be or as it has been, particularly among young scholars. Even the papers that we are teaching, often we are dropping kinship in various departments and institutions. Your work has had a lot of impact on kinship studies. Would you like to take us through a little bit briefly on that?
Yes, for me, Leela Dubey was the person who inspired me. But then after that, I engaged with many other authors and wrote a lot. And I would not agree with you that kinship is no longer popular.
Is it?
It is not popular as a separate paper called Family, Marriage and Kinship. But it has been redrawn and has become part of other papers, but with with some modifications. So the kinship topics are very much there. They're handled in a different way. It was not just because of feminism, but also because of the more culturalist approach to kinship.
Of course.
Where not everything is structure and emotion and feelings and other things have to be, what David Schneider pioneered, that has also had an impact. But feminism has had a major impact. It has questioned, and I'm just summarizing here, I've been part of this movement to question the idea, popular idea of the family as a sealed and harmonious unit meant to cushion or provide a cushion for the vicissitudes of real life for people in it, especially the men. And it is a kind of family hierarchies have been attributed to functional divisions of labor. Biological and functional also. And man the provider, woman the nurturer, etc. So this has given a certain image of eternal family and stable. But what I think gendered perspective highlighted the power dimension of the family, highlighted the implicit and explicit violence within the family. So sometimes because of feminist anthropologists, sometimes because of feminist activists who, in India, for example, talked about dowry deaths and domestic violence, sati, everything was from the family. So, how could this be a harmonious unit? That is one kind of looking at the family now as a dynamic power, one dimension, care and affection, also another dimension. It's not one or the other. And also at kinship rules. And here Iravati Karve made a contribution long ago that kinship rules are not esoteric, symbolic rules. And they have actually, they have material consequences for the people who live in them. And so that dimension,
Right.
entitlement to resources, to symbolic capital, to social capital, to friendships, to education, to nutrition, all this is governed to some extent by kinship rules. And women are affected in particular ways, very serious ways, but men too, and old and young and affines and kin. So to bring in the material dimensions of entitlements and actually getting those resources, I think this has been a big contribution of feminism into this field. And now this field, with the modern developments in reproductive technology, with the growth of the LGBT movement, and so the old notion of the family has become much more porous and multidimensional. But the notion has not been given up, I would say.
No, the notion hasn't, but our study of it has changed over a period of time. Kamla, a major part of your work has been on culture, and where you look at, for example, the two major works that I can think of is your work on Mother Goddess, which is on the early engagement, and then your work on the Saint Goddess, say something like what you did on.
So here we come to your earlier point that at certain time feminists were looking into their own roots because they were being accused of feminism being a Western idea and Indian women just importing it wholesale. It was a kind of a stick to beat feminists with. And at that time, there was a lot of concern about looking at history, looking at mythology. And one of the topics that some people wrote about was this Mother Goddess concept and Mother Goddess expressions and imagery.
Edited by Maitreyi Krishna Raj.
Yes.
There were a lot of sociologists and anthropologists.
They were different people. So I had my own personal interest in Mother Goddess. I have been culturally very rooted in Tamil, the Tamil milieu, even though I've been staying in Bombay for many, many years. And so through music, through dance, through pujas, there is a visual, oral kind of a presence of something that you have to take, I would believe, seriously. So I did some work on the Mother Goddess, but I tried to make a distinction between what we can say with historical accuracy and what we can use as for inspirational purposes, where we cannot date, where we cannot historicize, but they exist. They exist in a symbolic realm. And I didn't do that kind of psychoanalytical work, but I did see it as inspirational for feminists. And that is how I worked on the Mother Goddess idea.
Because, we know that one of the first feminist presses was called Kali, and then that has been questioned again now by, say, Dalit feminists who are Muslim in India, saying that it was a predominantly upper caste Hindu imagination, which we have corrected over a period of time.
Upper caste I won't say, because Mother Goddess is very strong in all castes. It's but using it as a logo for a book and all is a different matter.
No,
whether that represents. But the Mother Goddess is there among tribal communities, among Hindu communities of all strata.
Correct. Correct.
And very powerful ones, more powerful than.
So our project in feminism to retrieve or reclaim the mother goddess would be very different from, say, what you've seen in the nationalist project of, the nation.
Of course. Yeah.
And Kamla, then your work with Andal is something so wonderful. I mean, how did you come into that? How did you?
Again, Andal is a cultural heritage for us. And it is there, whether we go into it seriously or not. Andal is, if you are in Tamil Nadu, Andal is there every day in temples, in concerts, in her poetry. Her poetry is sung in the month of March.
So you have a feel for the Tamil region.
Because I have also learned Carnatic music throughout in very great detail.
Correct.
And Carnatic music is very text-based. And the texts are usually, not all, but many of them are about gods and goddesses and temples and incidents and so on. So that has become part of my, sensibility, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of research, young scholars.
So all the sensibility and now, there's a lot of discussion on bhakti and can we not have Carnatic music without bhakti? And there are some discussions like that. But if you take bhakti to be just an emotion for a transcendental entity, you don't have to reduce it to what the text says. It is quite possible. And I'll come to it when I talk about my Nagaswaram, Muslim Nagaswaram musicians, but just about Andal. Let me finish. Or should I talk about that?
No. Please talk about Andal.
Andal is, there have been feminists who have written about Andal because the second of her works, major work, Nachiyar Tirumozhi, is highly erotic and expresses her love for Ranganatha and her desire for union to consummate the union with him. So it is quite a...
Ranganatha being a Vaishnava.
In the Vaishnava, Sri Vaishnava sect and their culture.
Deity, a god.
Deity, yeah. No, yeah. So she was a god. So she is one of the Alvars. She is one of the 12 Alvars, 9th century AD, about 9th century AD. The others were 200-300 years. It's over 6 to 9 centuries. And she is included. She is the only woman to be included as an Alvar. And her major composition, Tirupavai, is on everybody's lips in Tamil Nadu. But Tirupavai is a simple hymn to Vishnu. I'm just summarizing. But her Nachiyar Tirumozhi is highly erotic, and that a woman who was very young and who was raised as her father himself was an Alvar.
Which century are we talking about here?
9th. 9th, it's approximately. Approximation. So that how could she write? Does that represent sort of a certain kind of freedom? And if you take Andal as part of the entire bhakti movement, then there are women who have railed against patriarchy and talked against the Vedas and the caste system. Andal didn't do all that. She was very much within that system, but she had a personal love for Narayana, which was impossible to achieve because she is a human and she is desiring union with a god. So you can look at it, but for me the more interesting, I'm not that interested in questions that can we call her a feminist. I'm not into those questions. She writes with great freedom. She writes, all that is there. But for me, the crucial question was, how is it that with such writing, she was included as an Alvar and then later on became a goddess in the Sri Vaishnava tradition? So it is really about this.
What you're saying is different from, say, somebody like Meera.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And Meera is also several hundred years later, or nearly 800 years later. So we can't put all the saints in one. So in the case of Andal, the Sri Vaishnava canon accepted her and maybe had to convert her into a goddess in order to make that poetry and her desire legitimate. Because as a human, she could not attain, in the Sri Vaishnava canon also, she could not attain in that way. They could get mukti, but could they consummate? This is very tricky question. So the canon has solved it not by rejecting her poetry, which is alive and well today, but by making her into a goddess. I think. So this is my way of thinking about
No,
it.
it's wonderful also because it's sort of
So it's not strictly feminist, yet I'm using a perspective from feminism to look at a goddess. Yeah.
and there is nothing strictly feminist. We are so varying. But I also think that some of these engagements of yours open up very important questions in the sociology of religion, in a gender sociology of religion, women's relationship with religion and faith. So yeah, that's a wonderful work. So now tell us about this work that you're doing just now, just so fascinating. The Nagaswaram players, Muslim Nagaswaram players who are, I think you're arguing, saying that they
Andhra.
signal in Andhra, but they signal towards very deep forms of syncretism, right?
Right. So as I began with the Kotte Pulemar, with a curiosity about a newspaper report and a vague idea of sociology.
Yeah.
Now I am, retired, and
have a lot of
I don't feel the need. I don't feel the need to necessarily frame projects as sociological or not. To me, they are all quite what shall we say, interactive. So it is also. I have been a student of Carnatic music in a very serious way, and I listen to concerts. So 2 years ago, I attended a concert. I attended a centenary tribute to Sheikh Chinnamaulana Sahib, who is a very well-known Nadaswaram player. And it is known that he is Muslim, but he migrated from Andhra to Tamil Nadu, and he became a very leading player. So that I knew that, but I didn't think more about it till I went for the centenary tribute, and his grandsons came and presented his work. And the way they talked about it in that the musical jargon and the Tamil and the dress and the deportment and so on. So I was a bit surprised, and I wanted to know more about it. That's how I found out that there is a whole community of Muslim Nagaswaram players in the Andhra region, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Nagaswaram is essentially a temple instrument of temple music, played during ceremonies inside the temple and played in the processions around the temple.
Also royal processions, you were telling me.
Royal processions and the processions of the deity, mainly processions of the deity, but also it's an auspicious instrument.
Yes.
Also associated with domestic rites of passage. At weddings, at various occasions, Nagaswaram has to be played.
Yes.
So, and it is a pure Carnatic music instrument.
Yeah, wannabe Tamilan always I wanted Nagaswaram playing in
Yes.
house and ready.
Yes. So I pursued this lead and went to places in Andhra and Telangana. They were associated in the past, they have some documentation of that, as Asthana Vidwans. Not in Tamil Nadu, in this Telugu-speaking regions, in some of the zamindaris, like Chilakaluri Pet Zamindar had appointed somebody as Asthana Vidwan, the Muslim Nagaswaram players. And they had legends and stories that connected them and do connect them even now to big temples, canonical temples, not some wayside temple where also they play. But the big canonical temples like Sri Shailam, Bhadrachalam, Tirupati, Sringeri, and small temples and other temples where they are recognized and given whatever is usually given in terms of honors and gifts and so on, like any other Nadaswaram player.
Which caste group would these?
These belong to a caste called the Dudekulas.
Okay.
Dudekula is the larger caste in, again, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Dudekulas are, the Nagaswaram group is a small group within that.
Okay.
They intermarry. So it is their caste group. They have a history of having been converted from low caste or a middle caste Hindu community, Dudekulas, into Islam by a visiting Sufi saint. It's called the Babaya of Penugonda, Fakhruddin Babaya of Penugonda. That is their history. And even if we take that to be historical. I think there is some basis for that history, the 12th century or something. They have retained many Hindu practices, the Dudekulas. Now, the Dudekulas are in several occupations. They are farmers, they are businessmen, but they have a lot of Hinduized rituals, but technically they are Muslims. And they lead their lives all these centuries. They have led it in a sort of a flexible identity, fluid identity, without, I think, causing too much commotion. This is something to be investigated. It could not have been all peaceful. But they have continued. They have continued and they continue to play in these temples. What is happening to them today is a different question. But to me, this, Carnatic music has been talked of as a bastion, not open to others, very sealed. And the Hindu temples are, it's not like celebrating Muharram festival altogether. This is a temple with its scheduled ceremonies and scheduled singers and priests and all that. In that, these people have had a place in it. And they have also managed to negotiate with their Jamaat and the mosques and so on, and led to, in differing ways. Everybody doesn't do it in the same way. So this is it's a historical phenomena which perhaps one has to, I'm still working on it, look at the social fabric of the Telugu region with the Adil Shahs and then the Muslim and Persian influence there, and the way the temples functioned, that they were able to, I would say, they were able to find a niche for this community, which did not convert back to Hinduism. Once they had converted to Islam, they remained Islam. They are members of the Jamaat and so on. Their personal beliefs may vary, but there is this community which is a dwindling community. But I think it shows us a window to the past. I would say in the medieval Deccan area, it has to do with with Sufism, it has to do with Islam and the way the Zamindari system. So there is something to be studied there. I've just started my work and this is where I am. It all started with a curiosity during a concert, during a lecture demonstration in the Music Academy. That has been, and I thought, why not? Why not follow it up?
That's a lovely way to introduce research also to young people to, pick up on little things. But no, I'm looking forward to this Nagaswaram work and how you theorize it more. I think it takes us away from simple theorizations of syncretism to say that they only existed outside of the orthodoxy. What you're trying to suggest is they were very much part of within orthodox. And all that. That's very fascinating. But Kamala, thank you very much for this very rich conversation, which makes us understand how over the last 40 years you've your personal and your research interests have combined themselves together in very wonderful ways, and you've dealt with questions of gender, caste, kinship and religion in very, very, I would say, nuanced and complex fashion. And so thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Geeta. We have, been having these conversations for a long time, for 40 years in bits and pieces, sometimes fighting, sometimes agreeing and so on. But it has been, and to get this opportunity to bring it all together in this kind of a forum, it has been a pleasure, again, revisiting some of our arguments. And thank you very much. And
thank you. And thank you
for Azim Premji University very much for giving us this very nice venue to be able to
space and the facility.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kamala.